Welcome to River City Community Church. For more information, please visit our website at www.rivercitychicago.com.
Well, good morning, everybody. Sunday morning here, and what a crazy time that we are in right now. We're in this, what is now the shelter in place, which is ratchet things up to even another level. And so while I so lament that we're not able to be here in person and be hugging, we are still, Aaron and I up here. You can see we are safely socially distanced from each other, but we really still think it's an essential task to come to worship and grow in worship, both through worship, through music, through word. And so we're glad you're joining us via Facebook, via Instagram, watching this on YouTube. We realize it's just a really crazy time, and it's hard. We realize there's some serious economic realities that people's jobs are at risk right now, and so you're in our prayers for that. I hope that you're continuing to be part of our email communications. We're looking at a lot of different ways to have prayer calls together, sharing prayer requests, a variety of different ways to kind of stay connected to each other. So please email us if you haven't. Follow us on the social media pages. We realize economically, this is a very difficult time. We realize emotionally, this is a really difficult time. When you're already struggling with any sense of anxiety or isolation, times like this just make it so hard. So we realize at that level, socially, to be single without kids can be hard right now, to be kind of trapped and isolated and disconnected. To be single with kids is so hard right now, having to manage no school support right now and doing that as a single parent. Our hearts are with you. Two-parent households with kids is challenging. Everybody's kind of navigating very tricky situations in this. And so we're going to be here for a minute, it looks like. So we want to continue to do all we can to support emotionally, spiritually, socially, through our times here together on Sundays, but also all throughout the week. So I realize at home you can just listen to worship already on Spotify or something like that, but I think there is something meaningful about knowing that our River City family, being congregated wherever we're congregated in this moment, that we're actually worshiping together and that our worship pastor is leading us in that. And so I'm hopeful that you can carve out a little bit of space where you're at right now and actually not just enjoy the music in a passive kind of a way, but really position yourself to the best you can to worship during this time and to allow God to sing over you and to allow us to sing back to God and to be reminded of who God is, especially in turbulent times like this. So Aaron will lead us in a time of worship, and then I'll share a passage that will be aimed to continue to deepen our sense of faith in God in turbulent times like this.
Good morning, everyone. Now, I can't see you, so I'm going to trust that you're going to have liberty. So you're in your house right now, and there's no one else there watching. So you can lift your hands, you can cry, you can weep, you can bow, you can bend. Whatever you need to do to get yourself in a posture of worship that will help you to find a place of peace and assurance. Because we know that as a body of believers that we have a promise from God that He is our protector, He is our provider, and everything that we need is in Him. So I'm just going to do a couple songs, and just going to have just a moment of intimacy with God. So we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. You give life, you are love, you bring light to darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. You give life, you are love, you bring light to the darkness, you give hope, you restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Come on, sing it with me. You give life. You give life. You are love. You bring light to the darkness. You give hope. You restore every heart that is broken. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs, so we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Come on, sing with me. All the earth. All the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth say, all the earth will shout your praise. Our hearts will cry. These bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. All the earth will shout your praise. Our will cry, these bones will sing. Great are you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise. We pour out praise. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out praise to you, Lord. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise. We pour out our praise. It's your breath in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you only. It's your breath, and we breathe, and we pour it out on you, Lord, in our lungs. So we pour out our praise to you only. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Great are you, Lord. Yes, he's a great God. We breathe his breath in our bodies. We thank you, God. We can give it back to you because you alone are worthy. No weapon formed against me, come on, be encouraged, shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon formed against me shall not prosper. No, it won't work. God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word, and he will come through. Yeah, God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word, and he will come through. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. He will come through. Yeah, God will will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. He will come through. God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. He will come through. I believe that God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. And he will come through. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon formed against me. Go when you sing this. Shall prosper. No, it won't work. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. When you declare this over your life, God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word, and he will come through. Yeah, God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. He will come through. No weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. Telling you no weapon formed against me shall prosper. No, it won't work. God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. And he will come through. Yeah, God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word. He will come through. No weapon. Hallelujah. Thank you, God, that there's no weapon formed that will be victorious against me. Soon as I stop worrying how the story ends, I let go, I let God, and let God have his way. That's when things start happening. I start looking at back then. I let go and I let God. Let God have his way. Soon as I stop worrying how the story is, I let go and I let God have his way. That's when things start happening. I stop looking at back then. I let go and I let God have his way. Couldn't seem to fall asleep. There was so much on my mind, searching for that peace, but peace I could not find. It's when I kneel down to pray, pray, Lord, help me please. He said you don't have to cry, 'cause I'll supply all your needs. Soon as I stop worrying how the story is, I let go and I let God. Let God have His way. That's when things start happening. I start looking at back then. I let go and I let God. I let God have His way. Soon as I start worrying how the story is, I let go and I let God. I let God have His way. That's when things start happening. I stop looking at them. I let go and I let God. I let God have His way. Let go. Let God. Let go. Let God. Let go and let God. Let go. 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 Let God. Come, let go. Let God, let go. You need to let God, don't worry about it. He's got your back. Let God have His way. Let go, let God, oh let go. Let God, let go, let God, let go. Let God, yeah. Soon as I stop worrying about the story is, I let go and I let God. I let God have His way. That's when things start happening. Stop looking at the news. Let go, let God. Let God have His way. Let God have His way. Let God have His way. to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Can you say with me? Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Come on, lift your hands. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Sing it again. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. Your name is victory. All praise will rise to Christ our King. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King, yes, is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. By your Spirit I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King is resurrecting me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King, yes. In your name I will rise from the ashes of defeat. The resurrected King, yes. He's resurrected me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. Yeah, the resurrected King. Hey, he's resurrected me. Your name, yeah, is victory. All praises will rise to Christ our King. We're singing your name, your name is victory. Yeah. All praise will rise to Christ our King. By your Spirit I rise from the ashes of defeat. Resurrected King, resurrected me. In your name I come alive to declare your victory. The resurrected King. Resurrected King. It's resurrecting me. Oh, he's resurrecting me. Oh, resurrecting me.
Well, wherever you're at right now, if you've joined us in worship, and thank you to Brother Aaron for leading us in that worship. Join me in prayer. Can you try to create a little bit of space, a moment here for us to just come before God? Well, dear God, it is in moments like this we've had to learn how to be connected virtually through social media, through technology over these last days and over this next period of time. And for all the challenges that brings, it continues to be a very concrete and tangible reminder to me of the fact that you are truly an omniscient, omnipotent God. A God that is not only over all of human history, but a God whose presence is simultaneously with us here in this space, in each home, where somebody is participating with this, in each phone where somebody's watching this. And just in the same way that your presence is with every faith community in every continent of the globe right now. And these are abstract truths that we often can remind ourselves of. But in times like these, in times where we really need to know of that all-present, all-powerful God, may something even as simple as the fact that we're watching this on devices, watching this on TVs, watching this on computers right now from all different parts of the city and for our extended River City families and beyond Chicago, may that even in of itself remind us that you are a God of victory. You are a God who is for us. You are a God who is absolutely and intimately connected to us in every place that we are. We thank you for that. We celebrate who you are. We ask for increased degrees of revelation and understanding of who you are in times like this. And in your name, and from every place where we physically occupy right now, all God's people said, amen. Amen. Well, thank you again. Thank you for Aaron leading us into that time of worship. You know, as we continue to do Bible studies in midweek Wednesdays, which we invite you to, we had a really powerful time gathering together online. This past Wednesday, we're going to go through Lent-based passages up through Easter in that venue. But here on Sundays, we're going to be really trying to be responsive to this reality that we're living in right now. And it's a scary time. I mean, it's certainly in my lifetime, we've never experienced something like this, a global pandemic of this proportion, experienced something where this is going to be one of the few times there's such immense privilege and power differentials in a country like ours, and I'm not minimizing those in any way, but this is going to be one of the few times where there's this kind of shared experience that affects all of us in a unique but also somewhat similar kind of a way. And so there's the very real threat of the virus that comes, but again, as we prayed at the beginning, there's all the emotional and social and spiritual kind of threats with that. I believe still in a lot of ways that the climate of fear we live in is one of the greatest threats of all. Fear, in fact, you may have heard this before, fear not, those two words in English, fear not, that's the single most frequently repeated command in the Bible, fear not. And there's a reason that comes up so often, because fear has got a real dangerous underbelly to it when it's not addressed in a healthy and holistic kind of a way. And even though it's just the tip of the iceberg of the times we're in right now, you know, the thing happening that we're all seeing that's such an icon of this climate of fear is this silliness but very real threat that comes with all this hoarding that's happening. Right? We're seeing this happen where otherwise reasonable people are going into stores and they're saying, okay, I need a loaf of bread. Maybe I'll take 2 loaves just to be safe, but instead of just taking 1 or taking 2, they'll say, there's 14 loaves on the shelf, I'm going to take all 14 of them. Right, knowing that most of those are going to go bad anyway, but this sense of panic, of fear, which then breeds this sense of scarcity and disconnects us from each other. Right? We are designed to be interconnected beings. We're designed to be interdependent beings, but when fear takes over, we look out just for ourselves. selfishness takes over, and this kind of atmosphere of scarcity takes over. And if it wasn't already serious enough that we're fighting this kind of global pandemic and some economic and social ramifications of it, there's this climate of fear that I think is really dangerous to the soul of us as individuals, to the soul of us as a collective. And so until it feels like we've gotten all the way to the bottom of this, I want to take a few stabs at this, because in the Bible, fear and faith are so deeply connected to each other. And you could say it negatively and you could say it positively. Said negatively, the Bible, one of the reasons fear not is so often repeated is because there's no greater threat to a vital and vibrant life of faith than fear. Fear is the number one thing that sucks the life out of our faith. Said positively, though, fear is a reality. The reason fear not is repeated so regularly in Scripture is because it's part of our daily reality. We are finite beings who, even though we would like to pretend we've got some modicum of control over our circumstances, we don't, right? Times like this remind us that we're way more dependent as creatures than some of us would like to admit. When fear comes, as it always will, without question in the Bible, the number one antidote for fear, the number one way that we address our fears is by learning how to go deeper into our faith. So faith and fear have this dynamic relationship with each other. And we see this consistently in the gospel accounts, in the incarnated physical manifestation of Jesus. He regularly brought his disciples intentionally to this moment, to this intersection of faith and fear, so that in times of anxiety and them being afraid, they can also learn how to deepen their faith in that time. And so last week we looked at, we titled The Lord of the Storm, when Jesus is with his disciples in the boat when this tremendous storm comes up and the disciples fear that their lives are in danger. And an even deeper, scarier fear for them is they question whether or not Jesus actually cares about the fact that their lives are in danger. And so we looked at how Jesus teaches them about fear and faith in that moment. So I'd like to, it's similar, but also quite different, but it's got that same Jesus, disciples, and storm kind of thing happening. Arguably one of the most famous times in the New Testament where Jesus teaches the disciples about fear and faith is when Jesus walks on the water. And Peter ends up joining him here. And so as you're joining in with us from wherever you're watching this, I'd invite you to open your Bibles and read this with me. It's in Matthew chapter 14, the account of Jesus walking on the water. And we're going to just kind of make our way through it verse by verse and try to draw out what I actually go so far to say. For me, this is the most powerful passage in the entire Bible about teaching us the nature of the interrelated relationship between fear and faith, and how it is that in times of great fear, we can learn to deepen our faith. So I'm going to read this. I'd invite you to kind of read along with me. It goes Matthew 14, verse 22, and we will go to the end of that part in verse 33. Matthew says it like this. Immediately, we'll get to it, immediately meant in a minute. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Amen. This is the word of God. All right, we are going to make our way through this passage. So it starts with immediately. So what Matthew wants us to know is that these are linked. Jesus actually just performed one of the more high-profile miracles that he'll perform anywhere, one of the ones that was most talked about in his time. Jesus feeds the 5,000, which in those days, the counting was just of the men. So the fact that he fed 5,000 could easily mean he fed triple that, 15 to 20,000. So it was this enormous crowd. Jesus feeds them with just a few fish and loaves and demonstrates the abundance of God's provision as all these people get their physical needs met. And so one of the reasons why that actually becomes an important detail for this passage of walking on the water is that the whole point of what Matthew is going to develop in this next section is the dynamic interplay between fear and faith and how they affect each other and how they're dynamic. They're not fixed kind of realities. They change depending on the circumstance and depending on which one is more operative in our lives. And so the significance of that is if there's ever a time where the disciples' faith is going to be at an elevated place, it's probably going to be after they just witnessed this miracle, right? They just literally saw Jesus take a small group, a small piece of, some bread, some fish, feed this entire multitude of people. So if there's ever a time that their faith should be at a zenith level, it should be right now, all right? And so Matthew wants us to see that not only are these chronological in how they happen, but it's actually based on a level of intention from Jesus. Jesus is going to choose this moment of proceeding, following this great moment of faith where he's going to then orchestrate this next thing. So let's just kind of make our way through. Verse 22. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. I know we're talking about serious subject matter, so I don't want to be flippant at all. But this part of the passage does feel a little bit humorous to me. So if I can just invite us to kind of sit in the humor of this before getting to some very serious lessons that God wants to teach us. So Jesus sent the disciples ahead. He knows, Jesus often said, I can only do what I see the Father doing. I can only do what the Father tells me to do. So Jesus lived in this deep sense of dependence on what God was leading him to do. So Jesus sent the disciples ahead, goes to have this really intense quiet time to connect deeply with God and to kind of sit in the significance of what just happened through this miracle, to kind of get to God's direction in terms of what happens next. So here's where I think it becomes kind of funny. As Jesus is asking God what to do next, you can almost hear this relationship, this conversation between God and Jesus, where God says, all right, we are going to take the disciples to the next level in their development of faith. We're going to help them go deeper in their faith than they've ever gone. But in order to do that, we've got to scare them more than they've ever been scared. So let's, in this intense, quiet time of spiritual intimacy, think together of what's the best way we can scare the disciples. It almost really does have kind of that feel to it, where there really is an important objective to it, where it's about deepening the faith in this moment. But there's almost like this creative brainstorm exercise that they engage in of what's a glimpse of our glory that we can show them, because Jesus often would talk about being connected to this glory that was always there as part of being part of the triune God. So it's like they say, what's a glimpse of our glory that we can give the disciples that will scare the living daylights out of them? And so you almost get this sense that in this quiet time while Jesus is on the mountain with God, in the presence of God, this is what they come up with. We're going to let that boat get way out onto the waters. And then Jesus, I want you, it's not all that often that Jesus operates outside of the created order in the physical realm. But in this case, Jesus is going to demonstrate that he is, again, outside of the created order, that he has authority over it all. And he's going to walk to them in not even the middle of the night, it's almost dawn, it says, and with the intention of just absolutely scaring them. So I actually think that's just kind of funny that we've all got our ideas of what happens in a good quiet time. In this quiet time, the idea was conceived to have Jesus walk on the water to the disciples. All right, so let's keep going. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. I don't know that much more needs to be said than what I just said. Other than this, I really do think some of us believe that God's goal for us is that we would avoid situations where we're ever afraid, that we've been kind of programmed at some point to think that if we're truly faithful, if we're truly connected to God in a meaningful kind of a way, that perhaps that will result in God helping us to deviate away from situations that would bring our fear and anxiety to a super high level. I hope this passage helps us remember, not only is that God's not intention, I mean, we see Jesus orchestrated this whole situation to happen in this kind of a way. So it continues, verse 26. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. Apparently the plan worked. Jesus orchestrated this situation to demonstrate his own glory in such a way that their fear would be brought really to the height of its possibility. I mean, they are the language in this is so emphatic. They're terrified, right? They're not just afraid. They're not just little a afraid. They are capital A afraid. They're terrified of just the conversion, right? They're sleepy. They're out on this body of water. They see somebody walking. The whole thing is crazy, right? Verse 27, this really gets to the heart of what we're going to explore. We'll kind of go slow here for a minute, and all the rest of this is really just developing this point now. Verse 27, Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Fear not." By one account, the phrase "fear not" is repeated 365 times in the Bible, one for every day of the Western calendar, conveniently. This is one of those 365 times. One of the more famous ones. Jesus comes to them and says, "Do not be afraid. Fear not." And this is where it almost feels absurd a little bit, right? Where Jesus intentionally designs a moment where he's going to display his glory, do it at a time when they're totally not expecting it, to do it in a way that produces the exact reaction he wanted them to have of absolute terror. He creates this with the intention of having them be totally, absolutely afraid. It works. They're terrified. They think they're seeing a ghost. And Jesus responds how? He says, "Fear not." Right? It feels almost absurd, right? How do you put those two together? How does God not only allow for, but actually intentionally create an environment in which their fear is going to be brought to a heightened level? And then Jesus responds by saying, "Fear not." That's where I think this passage is just so helpful for this journey, because fear not is not said in isolation, right? How Matthew records this is so important. They go together. It's fear not, but Jesus first says, "Take courage because it is I." Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I." That is why you can fear not. And this gets to what is a consistent and powerful principle about fear and faith in the Bible. God is not trying to eliminate environments where the presence of fear is real. That is never God's environment. That is never God's agenda, to eliminate environments where the presence of fear is real. God's desire for us is that the presence of Jesus in our lives would become more real to us than the presence of fear that's there. Right? The fear doesn't disappear. It's that the presence of God in our lives gets deep enough that we've got the spiritual strength to overcome that presence of fear. See, that it's all about which one is the dominant reality in your life at any given moment. Which is the more operative reality, fear or faith? I believe that is the heart of what Matthew is trying to help us establish here. Is, again, I just want to keep saying this over and over again. God's desire for you is not that you would no longer be present with fear. Right? God's desire for you is not that you'll be able to live this life where acknowledging and dealing and overcoming with fear and anxiety and terror even become the objective for you. That is just not what God wants. God wants you to be able to be so aware of who God is in the moments of fear that you do become fearless, but not because fear is not real. It's because you can be in the presence of fear and at the same time be in the presence of God, and the presence of God that you are connected to is stronger in that moment than the presence of fear that is all around you. Do you see how powerful that is, to release this mythology that fear not means we're never in the presence of fear, but instead to realize that we can be in the presence of fear, but that the presence of the powerful one who's the Lord of the storm can be more operative in that moment than the presence of fear? Let's keep going on this idea, because I think that's the height of what Matthew's trying to communicate here, but he continues to develop this to really help us see the nuances of this, the layers of this, the way that Jesus wants to continue to show us the interrelated and dynamic relationship between fear and faith. Let's keep moving. So Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Verse 28, "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." Now here's an important thing. I think for a lot of us who have heard this passage, a lot of us have kind of seen this passage through the lens of failure for Peter more than success, which I don't think is correct at all. I think it actually reflects how we see God. I think we're so conditioned to see God as being disappointed with us. I really think that's true. I think we're conditioned, or maybe it's even more than that. Maybe it's just there's this lie inside of us that just believes God is always disappointed with us. And so when we see something like this, we just jump to the conclusion that once again, there's the standard that God put out for us, and we just always fall short of what God wanted for us. But I don't think that's at all what's happening. I think this is a story of not only teaching about this relationship between fear and faith, but teaching how Peter understood something in this moment that none of the disciples did. And I think it's really in this phrase. Again, come back to verse 28. Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out on the water." Now, here's where I think that is so significant, where I actually think there's some pretty significant application for us. When Peter says this, what he's showing is that he understands what's happening in this moment. Right? It would have been very easy to misinterpret this as some kind of a circus trick where Jesus is showing his power, just to remind the disciples of the pecking order, that he's still the Son of God, that he can access the divine when necessary. Right? There could have been a lot of ways to interpret this, but Peter gets right to the heart of what Jesus is trying to communicate. Jesus' point in all of this is that you can be surrounded by an atmosphere of fear. You can be surrounded by what feels like a storm. You can be surrounded by all kind of uncertainty and instability and unknown, and yet it's possible to see Jesus clearly in the midst of it. And that's what Peter's doing. Peter's saying, if this is what's happening, if this is about you, if that's what the point of this is, if it's about you and an enhanced understanding of experiencing your presence, then say it. Help me understand that that's what it is. And apparently, Jesus wants to affirm that this is exactly what's happening because he responds with just one word. Come. Come. And as we're kind of making our way through, rather than saving all the applications for the end, let me just kind of draw something out here. We're looking at a very specific instance with Jesus walking on the water here, but the applications to the times we're in, I think, are very concrete and very significant. When times of fear come, again, God's intention is not necessarily to eliminate the fear that's surrounding us. Jesus, instead, his desire is that we would see him more clearly in the midst of it. And that simple question that Peter asks, if it's you, becomes one of the most tactile ways we can deepen in our faith in times like this. We can look for where Jesus is at. We can pray things over and over and over the course of a day. Lord, show me where you are in this moment. Show me yourself. Show me your presence in this moment. Matthew, I really believe, is trying to draw out that Peter sees something with absolute clarity in this moment. In fact, if you don't see it this way, the rest of the passage doesn't really make sense. Because what happens after that? Jesus tells Peter to come. Peter actually does, and he walks on the water. He walks on the water, and he comes towards Jesus. Then verse 30, it says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid. There it is again. Fear and faith live in this dynamic relationship with each other. When they saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately, it's another important word in this. The point in this is not that Peter should suffer or something, or that he's got to learn some kind of lesson. That if this is punitive, maybe let him flail in the water for a little bit to learn that. No. There's nothing about that Jesus is doing. There's nothing punitive about this. Immediately, Jesus reaches out his hand and catches him. Immediately. And then Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? And again, your starting point on this is going to really affect how you hear what Jesus is saying there. If your starting point is you believe Jesus is disappointed with Peter right now, that God just generally has a standard that we just can't seem to ever live up to, that the standard of faith that God wishes for us is just always going to be a little higher than what we can do, then that phrase, you have little doubt, you have little faith, why'd you doubt, is going to sound like Peter failed. It's going to sound like Jesus is really disappointed with him in that moment, like, right? I mean, this is how this version sounds like, Peter, you just can't ever get this one right, can you? Right? Always you of little faith, right? Always you have too much doubt. But really, if that's what Jesus was trying to communicate right now, is that there's a lack of faith and that's the big problem, wouldn't it have been much more appropriate to direct that at the 11 who were still in the boats, who never even took the risk to ask Jesus, what are you trying to do here? What are you trying to reveal to us in this moment? What would you want for us to, how would you want for us to respond in faith in this moment? I don't think Jesus is being harsh here at all. I think Jesus is actually just stating the obvious. And this is what Matthew's trying to communicate. So again, this is the heart of it. Fear and faith live in this dynamic relationship with each other. When fear is more operative, by definition, faith is less operative. And when faith is more operative, fear is less operative, right? It's not one is present and the other isn't. They're both present all the time. That's the human experience. The presence of fear will always be there. That's not the question. We can't eliminate the presence of fear, but what we can do is come to know the presence of Jesus in the midst of the presence of fear in a way that changes who we are. And so I think Jesus is just stating the obvious. Peter, a couple minutes ago, your sense of faith was greater than your sense of fear. And when it was, you walked on water. And then when you got on the water, fear became more operative and faith became less operative, and you sank. So it's just a basic question. What happened in that moment? Why is it that you were able to see me for the first half of this and not see me for the second half of this? And in asking this, he's serving this up for the disciples in general to see this, right? That the way you overcome fear is by seeing Jesus more clearly, right? The goal is not to avoid the presence of fear. The goal is to see the presence of God more clearly, more substantially, more powerfully, in a more heightened and elevated way. That's what God is wanting to do. And we see that in verse 33, they understood that was indeed the goal of this whole exercise. Verse 33 says, all those that were still in the boat, they started to worship him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Which is why we often talk about this love loop. It's kind of a silly phrase, but when we talk about worship, it really is this reciprocal kind of reality of love, right? I think sometimes we believe that in order to have the courage to do something, we have to worship first and gather up and head on out, which totally can be how it happens sometimes. But in this case, they lacked the courage. They lacked the ability to see who Jesus was. And it was in the demonstration of God's power, in the demonstration of Jesus' compassion for Peter in this moment, Jesus' authority over the created realm, that creates this sense of awe in them where they say, oh, wow, truly this is the Son of God. We worship him, right? Which I could do almost a little side thing there. It's interesting that it's in a moment of falling short for them where they have this really incredible, powerful moment of worship. And that's where Matthew concludes this account. It's a very visceral way to demonstrate the way that the presence of fear and the presence of faith, especially in the life of a believer, they always live side by side with each other. The question isn't, can we eliminate the presence of fear? The question is, how do we enhance this sense of the presence of God in our lives? So just a couple of concluding remarks on that one that I would just like to offer up that I believe are consistent throughout the Bible, very consistent throughout Jesus's development of the disciples as leaders. Fear and faith was this just consistent object lesson that Jesus would come back to. And I think it serves us well in times like this. We're in an atmosphere of high fear right now. Corporately, this is a reality. But for us individually, we're all negotiating very significant stress right now, anxiety right now, uncertainty right now. We're in a time In history right now, especially where it's happening all across the globe, but certainly here in America, we are in a time where the presence of fear is very, very thick. And I really do believe at some point this too shall pass. We will come out on the other side of that. I totally believe that. I believe God is going to shepherd us all through that. But I also want to emphasize looking forward to the circumstances changing is not really the main goal that God has for us. Right? Getting us outside of times where the presence of fear is very palpable is not God's goal for us. Right? God's goal for us is that in the midst of fear, we would learn to see him with greater precision, with greater power, that the authority that's absolutely true of who he is will become increasingly true of how we live, where we really trust who he is in the midst of that. So to say this first one, just really simply to repeat it again, because I think this is so important. God's goal is not to get you out of the presence of fear. God's goal is that you would learn to see Jesus more clearly in it, that you become aware of the presence of Jesus in the times of fear. All right. Secondly, I think another thing that this particular encounter reminds us is that actually one of the most stagnant things that could happen to your faith would be that you were never afraid. It is good for you to be afraid. Isn't that interesting? Now, we don't want to stay there because clearly that's the most repeated command. Do not fear, do not be afraid. But as we see here and in plenty other places, including what we did last week, do not fear is not the same thing as do not be in the presence of fear. Right? To be aware of your limitations. In fact, that's where the boat becomes such a powerful metaphor in this story. The boat represents this kind of illusion that I can somehow control my own circumstances. Right? When the disciples cling to that boat, it's a totally humanly understandable reality. Right? If I'm picking between go to the choppy waters, even though that's where Jesus is, or hang on to this man-made wooden boat, the temptation is always going to be to hang on to this wooden boat. But what Jesus was showing them is like, you don't actually have nearly as much control over your world as you think you do. Right? And so by creating this moment where fear is at such an elevated place, Jesus is actually creating the conditions for their faith to deepen. Right? So I just want you to grasp that ironic and important truth. You won't become a person of great faith if you don't get scared sometimes. And weirdly, I mean, none of us want to be super scared. None of us are going to choose that ever. That literally goes against the survival instincts. But if you wanted to know the environment in which your faith has the greatest chance to go to a new depth level, it's when you're most afraid. It's when you're most afraid. And that leads to the final point that I want to kind of just draw out from here. Matthew in particular is really stressing this dynamic, connected relationship between fear and faith. And I want to release this from, I really think this is a liberation even at some level. A lot of us buy into this mythology that just some people were born fearless, that great faith just comes easy for some people. And then there's the rest of us who are just kind of doomed to living a life of anxiety and fear. What Matthew shows us, what Jesus teaches us, is that these are not fixed realities. They're not just scared people and high faith people. Faith comes from learning to see Jesus more clearly, learning to come more into deeper contact with the presence of God. And what we see, again, there's just not a clear example of this in the entire Bible, I don't think, in this example of Peter. In one moment, right, so let's go through the progression. Peter sees Jesus coming out on the water, and fear is the operative reality, right? Fear is way greater than faith in that moment. But then faith starts to elevate as he becomes conscious of the presence of Jesus in that moment. When he says, "Is it you, God? Like, I'm scared, but I can see you in the midst of this." And as he sees Jesus, he can do something incredible, right? I mean, can you think of the stories that Peter told his family and grandchildren, if you remember, whatever, you know, the people that came after him is, hey, there was a moment I had a faith encounter with God at such a level that I literally walked on water, right? His awareness of the presence of God gave him such a level of power and authority in that moment that he did something that was supernatural. And then in the next moment, fear became more operative again, which doesn't dismiss this moment that he had. It just shows the fluid nature that these two realities, the presence of fear and the presence of faith, live next to each other. And at any given moment, one can be more operative than the other. And so at some level, this is God's work because that's faith. But this is where it becomes very real, very tangible for us, is when we feel fear becoming more operative. There's no need to collapse under that. We can slow down and say, the other reality is the presence of God in this. And to the degree that I can become aware of the presence of God, this will help mediate the presence of fear that I'm in the midst of. And I think, again, I see this passage as one that's just defined by grace, because fear and faith are not one-time opportunities. Right? You don't get one chance over the course of your life to prove whether you're faithful or not. Faith's like a muscle. It gets stronger each time you walk through this intersection of fear and faith. There will be times where fear wins, and all that you can take from it is like, yeah, fear won that round. There'll be other times, like with Peter, where faith won that round, and you can say, no, fear was very real, but so was the presence of Jesus in this moment. And it accumulates over time. And thanks be to God, what if this would have been the defining moment for the other 11 disciples? What if their defining moment would have been Jesus Christ, the Son of the Almighty living God, walked on the water to us, invited us out to him, but we were too afraid to respond in that moment? What if that would have been the defining moment? But it wasn't the defining moment. This was Jesus preparing them. This was Jesus developing them, right? This is something he was going to do repetitively, take them to this intersection of fear and faith so that they could deepen and understand how to see him more clearly. So there's comfort in that. Anxiety might win some rounds, fear might win some rounds, but you can get right back up. His mercies are new every morning. You can get back up the next day and say, today, I don't want fear to be what wins. Today, I want faith to be what wins. I want to be aware of the presence of God, even in the midst of the presence of fear. And that's what Jesus is drawing us to. That's what he's trying to grow us to. So for River City family, in very specific ways, I hope that we can embrace the magnitude of the collective, big picture societal fears that are happening, but also just the personal anxieties. I'm not saying they're not real. I'm not saying there's not very real things we have to contend with right now, whether it would be economically, socially, spiritually, emotionally. But what I am saying is that Jesus is with you in the midst of it. He is Emmanuel. He is Christ with us, God with us. And that might not do anything to get rid of the circumstances that bring fear for us, but boy, it can sure change everything in the moment as we become aware of who Jesus is in that. And so, again, glad to be here with you in this online kind of format. We're going to continue to reach out and stay connected as many ways we can. We will get through this. We'll come out on the other side of this, and what a day it'll be when we get to all be in person again and hug and handshake and feel totally confident in doing so. But in this time of instability and chaos, let us continue to remember that the same Jesus who walked on the waters to the disciples is the same Jesus that is in our midst. It's the same Jesus who invites us to go deeper and deeper in our faith, which is not something we summon. It's not about squeezing real hard on our spiritual muscles. It's about seeing him. It's about seeing who he is. It's about becoming aware of his presence in the midst of that. And so continue to stay faithful to the one who's been faithful to you. Continue to ask that question, Jesus, is it you? Show me who you are. Give me the eyes to see you in these times. Pray with me, if you will. Well, God, as we finish this moment live, for those of us who are with us, some they'll be watching or listening to this later. We know you're above all that. Your presence is absolutely and fully with each one of your beloveds right now. So God, it's been so spiritually stimulating for me, grounding for me to realize that great fear does not have to be an enemy to the work you're trying to do in me. In fact, if I can learn to see you more clearly, great fear can be the optimal environment for developing a deepened sense of faith in you. So we live in a scary time right now. We live in an atmosphere of fear. And I do think there's lots we cannot control. We're painfully aware of that. But there are conscious decisions we can make. We can make decisions about which thing we fix our eyes on. We can make concrete decisions about which things we meditate on. Fear, anxiety, scarcity, terror even, We can nurture those and play the what if games. But we also have the choice to look for ways to fix our eyes on you, as the writer of Hebrews says. Which is always connected to faith, because you are the pioneer, the author, the perfecter of our faith. So help us to do what I believe is held up as an example by Peter in this. Help us to see through the haze of the fear that's around us and to fix our eyes on you, to see you moving, operating in authority above that which would otherwise leave us in a state of fear. Help us to have encounters with you, moments with you, a palpable sense of your presence in this time, in a way that not only gets us through the season we're in, but leaves us on the other side as women and men whose faith is growing stronger. For I believe there is no substitute than physically and repetitively going through this intersection of faith and fear. Thank you for the grace that, like the 11 disciples, there will be moments where fear was more operative than faith. But thank you as well for being a God who is for us and continues to draw us out of the deep waters of faith into the opportunity after opportunity to see you in new ways, to be reminded that your mercies are new every morning. We thank you, God. We lift it up with a sense of gratitude to the one who is above all and who calls us to know of his presence in these times. In your name we pray. Amen. All right, we love you all. Again, we're daily doing things to stay connected, so invite you to virtually participate that in as many ways as you can. Get to the best you're able. I know these are tricky times, but if you're able to continue to support financially, you just have to go to the church website. There's a give icon right there. Though we're not physically in person here, the demands and needs of those who are on the bottom side of this are greater than they've ever been for us right now. So we're daily responding to concrete needs. So we appreciate that. Love you all. If there's anything you need, please feel free to reach out. We want to be really with each other in meaningful ways during this. So until the next time we see each other virtually, sending lots of love from River City. Goodbye.